The Cold War. In the second half of the 20th century, the Cold War was a geopolitical and ideological conflict that lasted from the end of World War II until the early 1990s. It was a conflict between the Western powers, led by the United States and the Soviet Union, and their respective allies. The Cold War was characterized by a lack of direct military action between the two superpowers, but instead by economic, political, and military tensions, proxy wars, and a nuclear arms race. The origins of the Cold War can be traced back to the end of World War II, when the United States and the Soviet Union emerged as superpowers. The two nations had vastly different ideologies, with the United States espousing capitalist democracy and the Soviet Union promoting communist ideology. These differences led to a growing divide between the two nations, and by the late 1940s, the United States had adopted a policy of containment towards the Soviet Union, with the goal of preventing the spread of communism. In the second half of the 20th century, the Cold War was characterized by a number of significant events and proxy wars. One of the most significant events of the Cold War was the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. The Soviet Union had placed nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from the United States. This led to a tense standoff between the two superpowers, and ultimately, the Soviet Union agreed to remove the missiles in exchange for a pledge by the United States not to invade Cuba and to remove its own missiles from Turkey. Another significant event of the Cold War was the Vietnam War. The United States became involved in the war in an effort to contain the spread of communism in Southeast Asia. The war was costly and divisive, and ultimately, the United States was not able to achieve its objectives. The Cold War also saw a number of proxy wars, including the Korean War, the Soviet-Afghan War, and the Iran-Iraq War. These conflicts were fought by smaller nations with the support of the United States or the Soviet Union, and they resulted in significant loss of life and destruction. The Cold War also saw a nuclear arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union. Both nations developed and stockpiled large numbers of nuclear weapons, and the threat of nuclear war loomed over the world. The arms race ultimately led to a state of mutually assured destruction, with the two nations having the capability to destroy each other in a nuclear war. The Cold War also had significant impacts on domestic and international politics. The United States and the Soviet Union engaged in a competition for global influence, with the United States supporting anti-communist dictatorships and the Soviet Union supporting communist governments and movements. This led to a number of human rights abuses and political repression in countries around the world. In the 1980s, the Cold War began to thaw, and by the early 1990s, the Soviet Union had collapsed and the Cold War was officially over. The end of the Cold War marked a significant turning point in world history, and it brought about a new era of international relations. In conclusion, the Cold War was a geopolitical and ideological conflict that lasted from the end of World War II until the early 1990s. It was a conflict between the Western powers, led by the United States and the Soviet Union, and their respective allies. The Cold War was characterized by a lack of direct military action between the two superpowers, but instead by economic, political, and military tensions, proxy wars, and a nuclear arms race. The Cold War had significant impacts on domestic and international politics, and ultimately, it was the collapse of the Soviet Union that brought the Cold War to an end, ushering in a new era of international relations.